Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is March 3rd, 2016, and my guest is Jayson Lusk, Regents Professor and Willard Sparks Endowed Chair of the Department of Agricultural Economics at Oklahoma State University. His latest book, and our topic for today, is Unnaturally Delicious: How Science and Technology Are Serving Up Superfoods to Save the World. Jayson, welcome to EconTalk.
Hi, Russ. Thanks for having me on.
Now, this book champions a pretty optimistic view of how technology and science are changing our food for the better. And not everyone agrees with that. One of your defenses of that position is that it's a very old story. How so?
Well, actually, if we look at a lot of the things we enjoy about our food system today, if we took a step back and thought about them, we would probably see that there actually were advances at some point in the past, whether it's 100 years ago or thousands of years ago. So a lot of our, ancient foods, wine, vinegar, these things were technologies at a time. Somehow our ancestors figured out to, if they wanted to preserve items, if they kept them in certain ways, they wouldn't spoil as quickly, would taste a little better. And a lot of the plants and animals we have around us didn't exist anything like the form that we see them today, even 1,000 years ago. So something like corn, for example, the ancestor of corn was probably about the size of your thumb. And it was only through selective breeding, not always purposeful.
You're not talking about the corn kernel. You're talking about the whole thing, right? When you
that's
say
exactly right. So, and to give the listeners a bit of a perspective, a modern day ear of corn would be about probably the size of your forearm, about the size of a foot. And so the modern ancestor of that several thousand years ago was about the size of your thumb. So that change that happened was because our ancestors picked the bigger ones. They kept those around, traveled with them, ate the ones that were a little tastier. And then, of course, we've used more sophisticated technologies. But, the more recent one with corn is hybrid breeding technologies. And that happened in the early 1900s. And if you look at a trend of, say, corn yields, that innovation of learning that if we were very specific about which strains of corn we crossed with another, just led to an incredible increase in the amount of food we could get for each acre of land. So we've been modifying the food we've been eating since the beginning.
Well, you say here, I was shocked and pleasantly surprised to learn that broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, and kale didn't exist before humans came along. Where'd they come from?
Yeah, there's an ancient weed, essentially a plant, and you can Google it and find it, and it doesn't look like much. It just looks sort of like an unruly plant. And, over time, people took that same plant and selected it in different ways. So some people focused more on the little flowers and tried to get them to grow productively, and that turned into broccoli. Other people focused on other parts of the leaves, tried to get the leaves to grow bigger, and that turned into the version of kale we have now. And then, just different people doing different things with that same plant led it to cauliflower and to Brussels sprouts. It's absolutely incredible. Of course, this wasn't biotech or GMO kind of stuff. These were just people trying to, adapt and sometimes probably not even all that purposefully were using plants in these ways that led to the outcomes we see today. And that's not a unique story. It's a story that is true for most of our modern foodstuffs.
Now, a lot of people would argue that that's okay. That was then, this is now, and that those older types of changes that we made, those were, quote, natural changes through breeding and standard methods. A lot of people are very worried or scared about what we're doing to food these days. We're going to talk about some of those techniques, some of the applications of science and technology. But just as a starting point, what would you say to people who are concerned about playing God with our food supply?
Yeah, that is a question I get a lot. And, sometimes it takes the form of something like, I just want food the way God gave it to us. As we've already been talking about here, the trouble is that there's no there. Which state of nature are we really talking about? The one 10,000 years ago, the one 1,000 years ago? Because we've really had a constant evolution in food that we've had. And I suppose one answer to your question is to say that people probably have always been a little skeptical of new foods. That's not necessarily a modern phenomenon. So there's some great stories about when the potato was introduced in Europe that people were sort of disgusted by it. They thought some people thought it looked like long fingers growing and didn't want to eat it. And of course, you can see that even into our more modern world, that there was a lot of aversion even to things like pasteurization or even microwaves, for example. So there's, I think, probably a natural human tendency to be a little skeptical of new foodstuffs, and that probably comes from our history, because humans had to be cautious about what we ate. I think Michael Pollan calls it the omnivore's dilemma. We got to be careful about what we're eating, but we also have to be adventurous enough to find new things and keep ourselves alive. And so, yes, we are concerned about a lot of the new food innovations, but I don't think that concern is necessarily new. There's probably some dimensions to it that are new and different. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It's a natural human tendency. But one of the things I'm trying to do in this book and in my other writings is, put that gut emotional reaction to the side and let's look maybe at a little bit of the evidence. And you don't have to take a new technology just on blind faith. But, let's look and see what the science has to say about it and use the best information we have to see whether it's something we might want to use.
We'll come back to some of those issues at the end, but so let's start and look at some of the things you talk about in the book. Really a fascinating and a delightful book of things that are going on in the food world. Some of them will scare some people, I suspect. Some of them, I think, will amaze folks. So I want to start with chickens, which is something I've always enjoyed thinking and reading about. I'm not quite sure why, but I'm always fascinated by the incredible productivity of the American poultry industry. And you write that in 2014, the United States was home to more than 300 million hens who laid 86.9 billion eggs for our dinner table. Added all up, and the average American ate about 260 eggs last year, an amount roughly equal to what a single chicken lays in a year. That, close quote. Now, that's an American chicken. Of course, in the less developed parts of the world, chickens are less productive, which is in itself also interesting. And those are just egg layers. Of course, for eating of chickens, there's, I guess, something over 1 billion chickens alive right now. There's, the last time I looked, there's about 4 chickens for every person being raised for their dining pleasure. And one of the things people worry about is that, especially egg-laying chickens, they are typically raised and live in cages with very little freedom, very little opportunity to experience whatever a chicken experiences in a different world, a wilder world, to whatever extent that exists. And a lot of people were upset about that and promote free-range chickens and other solutions. So what do you think of these concerns, and what has happened in some of the what are some of the innovations people have done to respond to those concerns?
Well, the first thing I'd say about concerns about animal welfare, they're certainly valid concerns. They're legitimate, and they're things that we probably want to think about and worry a little bit about. The trouble is, and this is true of so many, of life's pressing problems, is that the answers aren't nearly as easy as they might first seem. And there are lots of really tough trade-offs when it comes to thinking about issues like animal welfare. And, there is kind of a common view, I think, in which food and agriculture was great in the 1940s and 50s. We had all these free-range chickens running around on small, diversified farms. And, man, if we could just get ourselves back there, we'd be a lot better off. But, the world we see today is a result, yes, of a lot of technology changes. And when you think about the question of why would these farmers start bringing chickens indoors in the first place? Chickens don't like to be outside when it's hot or cold any more than you and I like to. So farmers learned that if they brought them inside, they could protect them from weather. The other thing it did is it protected them from a lot of diseases. And surely people are familiar with the bird flu epidemic that hit the U.S. last year. Killed millions of chickens, and that happened because of contact with wild birds. And so, you bring the animals indoors, it at least helps protect a little bit against some of those problems. And then we can start feeding them more specialized diets and make them more productive and picking better genetics. So, this wasn't some evil plot to be mean to chickens, but it's sort of the evolved process that led to this point where, and the driver ultimately isn't some big evil corporation, but I think it's often you and I, the food consumer. When we went in the grocery store and we saw a lesser priced alternative, we typically went for it. And that competitive pressure led to the sort of outcomes we see today. And I think the difficult question is what are the alternatives and what can we do about it? And throughout this book, I often will draw contrast before two ways of dealing with problems. And one of probably the most popular method, at least the one with the cultural cachet today, is the sort of romantic traditionalism method. So the answer is, if we don't like all these chickens in cages today, well, let's just go back to this way we did it in the 50s. Open the doors, let the chickens run wild. And there's some merits to that approach. There's some
people
things
are doing it. People are doing it in their own backyards.
Oh, they sure are. In fact, one of my neighbors, in fact, has some outdoor chickens, so I get to see them pretty frequently when I go for walks in my neighborhood. And so, yeah, it is taking on. That's great. People like doing that. And actually, those kinds of eggs can be a little tastier because the animals get they get a more diversified diet. But, especially when you look at those statistics you quoted about just the volume of egg production in the U.S., it's really incredible. I think most people don't really realize how many eggs they're eating in a year and how many animals it takes to produce those. And so to imagine, going from the world we're in today to one where everything was grown in that kind of production system is really hard to imagine. It could be done, but eggs would be certainly a lot more expensive, and we need a lot more land to do that. And so the other kind of alternative model is, are there some technologies or some changes we can think about in terms of new technologies or even new economic approaches that might lead to better outcomes? So most people, if they go in the grocery store today, you can buy cage-free eggs. You can buy if there's no label on it, it's probably eggs from chickens that were living in these small cages. People call them battery cages. Or you might see cage-free eggs. And those are typically the alternatives that are presented to us in the grocery store. There are organic eggs, which are essentially cage-free. But those cage-free eggs, we have a lot of ideas about what that means. But the reality probably isn't what most people think it is. It's just a very large barn where the chickens are essentially have the ability to roam around wherever they want. And the advantage of that over the cage system is the animals have more freedom of movement, and they can exhibit some of their natural behaviors like scratching in the dust and doing the things that chickens have natural urges to do. But the thing a lot of people don't realize is there are a lot of real downsides to that sort of production system too. There tends to be, it's not always the case, but there tends to be higher mortality rates. So the hens die a lot more in those systems. So that, when you think about animal welfare, dying is about the worst it can get. And one of the reasons they die is because this thing called a pecking order, it's a real life thing. You put a lot of chickens together that don't know each other. They're gonna compete for dominance, and so they'll peck on each other, and that causes some problems. And the other issue there too is there's just a lot of it's a really dirty, dusty place in a lot of these open barn systems, and that affects the chickens' health, but also affects the workers' health. So you're again back to this tough issue of trade-offs. We'd really like these chickens to have more room, but when we give them more room, they fight with each other. They tend to die at a little faster rate, and it creates these environments that are really smelly and dusty. And so that, I'm not advocating for one type of system over another, but it's a tough trade-off. And so one of the things I ask in the book is there a way through this trade-off? Can either a technological development or a development in I talk about an economic development even that you might use to get us into a better position. And
so talk about, is it JS West? Is that the name of the company?
Yeah, this is a company out in California. They're a very large egg producer out in California. And there's some interesting politics in California because back in 2008, a ballot initiative was before the voters there in that state, and they essentially voted to ban these gestation crates. I'm sorry, that's for pigs. They voted to ban the battery cages for chickens. And so the producers out in California were stuck having to figure out what they were going to do next. And they knew about the cage-free systems, and a lot of them did that, but it wasn't clear that was going to be the best alternative. And so as it turns out, there have been some researchers in Europe working on this problem for a number of years, and there was sort of an innovative compromise between this cage system and this cage-free system. And it's a type of cage called a enriched cage or a colony cage. It goes by a variety of different names. But it's an attempt to try to combine the advantages of these two systems. And so what it is essentially a much larger cage, probably about the size of a king-size mattress. It's about that large, and it's got quite a few birds in it, probably 50 to 60 birds in there, but they've got a lot more freedom of movement, so they can move around a lot more. And it has some amenities that aren't there in those tight battery cages. So there are perches the birds can get up on. There's a little area where they can dust bathe. There's a little area. Yeah, exactly. There's
a good dust bath to open the door.
And there is a little area where they can lay their eggs in a nest. And, it's not surprising, but the hens like to have a little privacy when they're laying their eggs. And so even though they've got this big cage, they almost always go in that nest area where it's a little secluded to lay their eggs. But, you don't have the situation where there's, thousands upon thousands of birds in this big open barn. So the sort of pecking issues are not nearly as problematic. It's still there, but it's not as big an issue. And you don't have nearly the dust problems and the particulate matter emission problems that are there in the cage system. And so it's an innovative compromise. It's also a compromise in terms of cost. If you look at the cost of production, it's somewhere between that cage system and that cage-free system. And so, it's a new technology. It's something that scientists, animal welfare scientists were working on for years as a way to try to think about ways of making chickens' lives better while not increasing our food budget too much.
So the coolest thing about this, we'll put a link up to it, is you can actually watch the chickens live on camera. The company wants to be transparent, and the thing you notice is that they are still pretty crowded together. The other thing you notice is something I've heard from agricultural people as well, which is chickens are really nervous. They don't really take advantage of they're not lounging around, taking advantage of a little extra space. They're just nervous creatures. They're very busy.
They are. When you walk into one of these barns, when a human comes in, they know it. And they move around, and exactly, they're a little neurotic, perhaps.
Who knows? It's hard to know. They could be very relaxed inside, serene as can be.
The one thing I would say, though, is, you are right. And I think it's awesome that a company like this gives that sort of transparency to let the consumers see what they're doing for their own selves. And some people are kind of surprised by it. They think, wow, I didn't realize the conditions were so small or what have you. But, what I would contrast that, though, against is not your romantic ideal of what free-range chickens are, but rather the reality of what free-range chickens are.
I always say the romantic ideal is a chicken from like The Sound of Music, leaping across the valley or the mountainside, singing joyously in their freedom, and it's not what they are.
No, in fact, just as a little anecdote, I will often teach a summer school in Italy in the summers, and a couple of years ago, a student in the class, his family ran a farm nearby, and he said, "Would you like to go see my family's farm?" And I said, "Oh, that'd be awesome. That'd be great." And, it's just a sort of idyllic, sort of small Italian family farm that you might think of. Had some, had a little winery there, and they had some cows, and they had some free-range chickens. And where were those free-range chickens? Where did they love to be? On the manure pile they kept right outside of of where they kept the barn with the cattle. And a lot of those chickens didn't look very, very good either. They were being pecked on by others. And but that's what free range is. And so when we look online at say J.S. West's operation, we don't want to compare it, as you say, to the Sound of Music or whatever chicken. We want to compare it to the real life free range chicken.
They also, of course, they're more likely to get parasites. It's tough, like being in a chicken, I think, in a battery cage or outside a battery cage. So we'll just leave it at that. Let's move on to 3D food printing and the robot chef, because that's really some amazing stuff going on there, particularly the robot chef.
It is. I saw a little, just a small excerpt in a sort of industrial magazine about this company that had come to a trade show and introduced this robotic chef. And I thought, man, I have to learn about this. This sounds really interesting. So fortunately, I was able to get in touch with the maker. So I'll talk about the robot chef first. This is not a robot like, say, on the Jetsons where they're moving around talking to you. It's sort of think about a large kitchen cabinet almost that has robot arms attached to the top. And these arms can move back and forwards and they can grab things, but they're sort of placed above a kitchen stove with a microwave and some other things near it. But the really interesting thing about how this works is that they take chefs, in the case of this Moly Robotics, they took the winner of the British show Top Chef and asked him if he'd put sensors on his arm while he was preparing a meal. And so the computers are recording his every movement as he's preparing his dish. And then they can translate those movements. They can essentially program the robot to mimic those movements in every way of the chef. And for me, the really cool thing about that is I'm a little bit of a foodie myself. I like to eat nice food and go to nice restaurants, but sometimes it's expensive. And sometimes I've tried to make the same dishes as some of the celebrity chefs do in their restaurants with varying degrees of success. But the cool thing about this is, if it's the sensors attached to these chefs' arms, we're getting an exact replica of what they would do if they were in our homes.
It's so cool. It reminds me of two things that remind me of. One is Andy Serkis, who plays, in the Planet of the Apes. He wires himself up and acts, and it gets transformed into this animatronic creature that has his facial expressions, and it's a very similar thing. And the other thing it reminds me of in a much milder way is Ratatouille, where you have the
right.
The rat up and under the hat of the chef who doesn't know what he's doing, but he's basically steering him, and that's what this is. There's an algorithm that's reproducing what a great chef in theory would be. It did, literally, not would do, but did.
Yeah, and in the same way from that movie Ratatouille, that the chef was able to kind of pull a fast one over his diners by thinking he was the one creating this great meal. We could do that for our friends and family. Look at this great meal I prepared. all the while, we've got some robot in the back room doing it for us. But yeah, so I think that it's just a fascinating technology. It's not on the market yet, so it's something they're still in development. But I think they hope to have some models ready for sale in 2017. So yeah, whether this takes off or not, it's hard to tell, but it's certainly a really cool idea. And it's a really cool idea when we think again about our past with food, because if we go back even 50 years, think about your mom or your grandmother and how much time they spent in the kitchen. And there's just been incredible change over time. Part of it's social norms. So we men are sort of expected to help out a little more in the kitchen. That's probably a good thing. But a lot of it's just technology differences. And you can see it in these time use surveys that try to monitor how people are spending their time throughout the day. And the average woman today spends half as much time in food preparation, about 100%, 80 to 100% less time in meal cleanup. And that is amazing. Those aren't chores, especially the meal cleanup part, that really anybody likes. Cooking, we might like, but often, when I cook, it's on my own terms. But, there can be a little drudgery to it if we have to do it every day, day in and day out, especially we're shuttling the kids to soccer and trying to make meetings and all those sorts of things. And so the ability to turn those jobs over to a robot or for food processors to give us foods that are more convenient, it's really, I think, really increase the quality of life.
Well, you'd think the next step would just be a box, a quote. We call a Cuisinart a food processor, but what we really want is a food processor where you just open a drawer, you put in a bunch of ingredients, you call up the right recipe, and it does all the things inside the box, right? It's sort of like a robotic surgeon, but you don't have to have anybody guiding the arms. You'd think that would just be the future, right?
Yeah, what we really want is the Star Trek food replicator where, Captain Kirk just goes, pushes a button, and you got something waiting for you right there. that's the ideal. And that doesn't mean people can't still cook if they want to, but
I use a fountain pen.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Now and then. Not often. I wish I had more reason to use. I'm trying to think of reasons to use my fountain pen. I'm enjoying the tactile thrill of old-fashioned writing, but
yeah.
The 3D printing is kind of Captain Kirky.
It is. It's moving us in that direction. It's not all the way there, but it's a step in that direction. And so there have been scientists working. There's some researchers at both Cornell and at Columbia that have been working on this for probably 10 years now. And so people have probably seen the 3D food printers that print things in plastic, and you give it some shape or some figurine, and it can replicate that. And the 3D food printer works in a similar way, but instead of dealing in plastics, it's dealing in foodstuffs. And it's really interesting. A lot of the applications today are frankly with things like chocolate that are easily moldable and that you can sort of melt and get into a more liquid state, and that will dry up. But they're moving in a lot of other directions too. And I think one of the interesting stories is that one of the first people to print a 3D printed food was a high school girl for her science fair project. That she got her hands on one of these printers that the folks at Cornell were putting out, and she affixed a chocolate a device that would squeeze out the chocolate in just the right proportions. And she won her science fair, and I think they've taken the idea and run with it in a lot of different ways. And so, like for example, Hershey has a variety that can make these really intricate looking chocolate creations. You could print a piece of chocolate in your name, or in sort of almost the shape of a jungle gym, if you will. There are other varieties of this that print in sugar. I'm not 100% sure how they work, but you've got one nozzle that's pushing out sugar, and the other one that's pushing out water, and it's crystallizing that sugar.
Cool.
And you can look at pictures online. They're really artistic creations more than anything else. But there is some serious food being made there too. I think the Culinary Institute of America has bought one, and anything that can be made sort of, again, into something that's a little softer can be printed. And so pastas, for example, are being made, pastas stuffed with, any variety of things that can be put inside of a pasta. Cheeses are being printed. And, these are, I think, interesting ideas. I think one of the more interesting parts of it is this idea of customizability. So, when you think about printing, you might think, well, this is some kind of evil processed food. But processed food, one of the characteristics of a processed food is often that it's just homogeneous. It's all the same for everybody. And at least the hope with something like 3D printing is that, Russ, you can have your cookie with, your initials printed on it, and I can have mine with my initials on it. And it's not just the look of it, but it's also the content. So if you want a little more vitamin A and I want a little more calcium, I can do those. In fact, we might even be able to put our, whatever medication we need, whether it's allergy medication or your cholesterol pill. Perhaps we can have this sort of personalized pharmaceuticals in our granola bar when we print it in the morning. So this whole idea of customizability and uniqueness is a really interesting twist, I think, that one could put on this idea that otherwise could be considered some kind of processed food.
Let's move on to a slightly more controversial and maybe important area, which is fertilizer. One of the things I thought about reading your book is what a great word fertilizer is. I never think about it. It's right. It makes the land more fertile. I'm going to read some statistics here on costs, that you write about, that I was fascinated to read. You say, quote, for example, in 2014, a central Illinois corn farmer was likely to spend $173 per acre on fertilizer and $66 per acre on pesticides, even on highly productive farmland, and all that was on top of the $119 per acre the farmer paid for seed. Of all the non-land costs associated with growing corn in Illinois, 30% are tied up in fertilizer. And you give a lot of other examples, but a lot of people complain that we've through overplanting and over-farming, we've drained soil of its nutrients, and we have to use these artificial fertilizer methods. Talk about what's your assessment of that argument and what's going on to try to reduce the amount of fertilizer and still keep yields high.
So I think there are some real concerns, and there are some concerns about over application of fertilizer. So as you mentioned, it's not inexpensive, particularly in the years I cited there, like 2014. Fertilizer prices are going to vary quite a bit with oil and gas prices. But yeah, I mean, they're costly. So farmers aren't just putting the stuff on the land because it's cheap. But it can act as a little bit of insurance. So if I get enough rain, I want enough fertilizer there to make sure I boost yields enough. And so the trouble is, though, when fertilizer runs off, it can get into our waterways and it can create these dead zones because it encourages the growth of algae and bacteria that can consume all the oxygen in the water. So these are real concerns. I think the more challenging question is, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to go back to these farms of the 1950s? Or is there something better that might be on the table? And when I look out there, I think most people have no idea the sort of sophistication and technological innovation that's happening on most commercial farms these days. It's really absolutely amazing. One thing I might do, if you don't mind, is take a little bit of a step back and just talk about a really interesting study that's been going on for over 100 years here at my university at Oklahoma State.
I love that. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, people are worried about sustainability and are we going to have enough food in the future given our current practices? And a really interesting example of that is that there was the first professor of agriculture at Oklahoma State University. He was hired in the 1890s. He started an experiment that runs to this day. And basically what he wanted to know is what happens when I plow up this native prairie land and plant wheat and just do it year after year after year and never provide any additional fertilizer. So he was very much interested in this question. And, this kind of research is going on all across the country at various universities like mine. But I just think it's a fascinating example and way to illustrate that there are agronomists and soil scientists that have been interested in this stuff for a long time. And the interesting thing about that study is if you look at the wheat yields from that study 120 years later, we're actually getting more wheat than he did in 1890s. And how in the world is that possible? Even though he's never provided any more fertilizer. And the answer to that question is that they're planting new varieties of wheat on that land, so better genetics. So one way to think about that is that the improvements in genetics have more than offset the losses in soil fertility. But the good news is we don't have to accept losses in soil fertility. We can add fertilizer to it. So the traditional form of fertilizer was manure. And so the amount of fertilizer was constrained by the amount of animals that we had around. And there was this really amazing discovery in the 1900s, but by a couple of German scientists, Haber and Bosch, and they learned how to pull nitrogen out of air. And that's the way we get most of our nitrogen today. And there's a lot of estimates out there, but again, this is sort of the sort of thing that I think a lot of people don't think about. But the ability to extract that nitrogen out of the air allowed us to grow a lot more food. And there's some estimates that suggest that probably somewhere around 4 billion people on this earth today owe their very existence to the fact that these two German scientists were able to figure out how to get more nitrogen. So in other words, nitrogen has been the greatest limiting resource in agriculture, this fertilizer, throughout most of human history. And so now we're at this other problem that now we have so much of it that we in some cases overuse it. And so how can we cut back in a responsible way? And so I talk about a couple of different examples, but there is a company here out of Oklahoma called SST Technology that is sort of a precision agriculture company. They're a data management company. And what they allow farmers to do is to keep track of their farmland and keep data on the amount of nitrogen in the soil in addition to the amount of water in the soil, and combine that with data on these yield monitors. So most of the time farmers of any size today, when they go through and harvest their corn or wheat or soybeans, they're calculating how much yield on every square meter, for example, as they go through that field. So you get these really pretty maps of which areas of the field are yielding higher and which are yielding lower. And so this company I talk about in my book in SST is combining all this data in ways that are allowing farmers to make really precise recommendations and fertilizer applications. So only applying fertilizer in those areas of the field that actually need it, and then, not over applying it in other areas that don't. And it's really cool technology. I mean, it's actually all cloud-based now. An agronomist can go in and use that software to make a recommendation. I want this much fertilizer in this area and this much in that other area. They send it up to the cloud, and it comes down to the fertilizer applicator, and it automatically makes adjustments as it's moving through that field. It's just really an incredible use of big data and modern technologies.
Let's turn to meat. I'm a very eager eater of meat myself. My wife is a vegetarian. So we span some of the range of choices people make about their food habits in our one house. But a lot of people say, meat's inefficient. You take all this corn with all this great nutrient stuff and you turn it into a cow, and the cow, it's an inefficient way to get your calories. It contributes to global warming, and a lot of people are upset about it. Now, of course, there's two ways you could deal with it. You could encourage people to be vegetarians, which of course is going on all the time. And my wife fell prey to that, and God bless her. I respect that choice. I seriously do. I'm joking a little bit, but I think it's a great thing to be a vegetarian if you can be, mainly for moral reasons, not environmental reasons. But I'm open to the possibility that it has moral consequences. It has environmental consequences I don't know about. But what's your thought on this? And what are the possibilities of laboratory grown meat, which you write about in your book, which is really interesting?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of issues that you brought up there. Let's take the first one about inefficiency, and I hear this one a lot. One way it's sometimes put is, feeding this corn to cows is just wasteful. It's like going down to your supermarket, buying 6 boxes of cornflakes and throwing 5 of them away and only eating one. I think that's the wrong way to think about it. And one way I think about it is by using a little bit of an analogy. So let's imagine we had some scientists. They're off searching for new plants. They head down to the Amazon. They find some brand new plant never heard of before, and this plant is an incredible producer of calories. It pumps out the calories given small amounts of fertilizer. But they get back to the lab and do some tests and find, it's too bad. This new plant is toxic to humans. We can't eat it. But the scientist goes back to the lab and comes up with a machine that can take this new plant and convert it into food that's really great tasting. Unfortunately, this machine uses up energy. It takes a little bit of water, and you lose some of the calories in the process. Well, is this scientist a hero, or are they some evil villain? Well, I don't know. I think there's a lot of ways to think about this. We should really applaud the scientists for finding some really cheap way of producing calories and then turning it into something that we really want to eat. So let's call this new plant corn, and let's call that machine the cow, and that's what we have. Most of us don't want to eat the corn that's grown directly in the field. Most of the corn, by the way, that's grown is field corn. It's not the sort of sweet corn that we think about eating. And why do we grow this much corn and soybeans as another plant? And it's because they're really efficient producers of calories and protein, but they deliver those calories and protein in a form that we don't typically like to eat. And also, the one nice thing about them is that they're in a form that's easily transportable. So we can put them on trucks or on barges and send them across the world. So they're great sources of calories and easily stored and transported, but they're just not very tasty. And so what we want to do is turn those into something that we like to eat. And you're exactly right. Most of us like to eat meat. And if you look at the data, probably at least 95% of the U.S. population are meat eaters. And I kind of agree with you. In a lot of ways, I respect someone who can give up eating meat because, boy, it'd sure be hard for me. And I suspect for a lot of people, both for health reasons, but also because it's just really tasty. We enjoy it. And we probably enjoy it because Mother Nature gave us some reasons to enjoy it. Most meat comes it's a It's packed full of vitamins and contains some fat that's good for our bodies and some things we couldn't get in other ways. And so, yeah, and if you want to look at it one way, you could say meat is wasteful. But if you look at it in another way, what cows do is they take one form of calories and convert them into another form that we like to eat. And I should say most cows throughout most of their lives actually eat grass. So these are actually calories we couldn't directly eat as humans. But there are environmental concerns. So one of the big problems with beef is that the digestive system of these cows is such that it produces a lot of methane. So cows burp, this methane goes into the air, and people are worried about the contributions to climate change and so forth. And so, again, we're back to this question again, this is a problem. We can all agree it's a problem. The question is, what are we going to do about it?
Well, it's obvious the answer is we just need to put a little Zantac with the 3D food processor or the whatever, so that the cows wouldn't burp as much. But maybe they just explode, it'd be worse. Anyway, sorry about that. Couldn't resist.
There are some options down that line. So I know there's some scientists working on various forms of grasses, for example, that are more easily digestible for the cow. So that is an option. But one option is the one that's been relentlessly pursued by the meat industries, which is just to get a lot more meat out of each animal using less resources. And boy, we sure do that now. And in fact, we have fewer cows in the U.S. today than we had in the 1950s, even though we're getting about twice as much meat. So we're getting a lot more meat from each cow, and that's come about through a whole host of technological changes, changes in genetics, and a variety of other things. But entirely.
Talk about the lab part.
Yeah, the entirely new way to tackle this is to say, let's just take the cow out of the equation. And so I talked to a guy named Mark Post. He's a professor in the Netherlands. He found out that if you take out stem cells from an animal, muscle stem cells, that these cells will naturally reproduce themselves. That's what they do. So he extracts cells, these stem cells from a cow, and he puts them in his proverbial petri dish with some food for them to eat, and they grow into muscle fibers. And then they attach those muscle fibers to each other, and then eventually, after a while, you've got muscles. And that's what meat is. It's just a bunch of muscles from animals. And so, yeah, he's created lab-grown meat from these stem cells. And the idea is that we could imagine a world where we just have a much smaller number of donor animals. By the way, it doesn't kill the animal to take the stem cells. They can still live and eat their grass and do the things they like to do while we pull out a few stem cells and then use those stem cells in a lab to produce the thing that we like to eat. And I saw
when you say fewer animals, it's a lot fewer. It's not like just less, right? It's a radical reorganization of the beef industry.
Yeah, tens of millions less, probably worldwide. Exactly. So he's done this. He had a big media event about a year ago out in London where he tasted his burger in front of a big audience of journalists and some celebrity chefs. I actually asked him how it tasted. He said he thought it was a little dry. And the reason is, once you think about it a little bit, it's kind of obvious. If you have just a bunch of muscle, there's no fat in it. So if you want it to be a little tastier, he's got to figure out some ways to get some fat stem cells to make some fat.
I have to ask you about that event because I read about it in the book, and it was fun. But why didn't he let someone else taste it? Is there a worry? I understand when a doctor injects himself with his own vaccine because people are scared and they don't want to give themselves some disease and they're worried about it. But were people worried about it? You watch these cooking shows and you see all the cook tastes the food, makes this great face. You want to say, well, I'd like to be the judge of that, not the person who cooked it. So did anyone else steal a bite of it?
I think
get a second opinion.
I think there were 2 or 3 people. So he had a celebrity chef there. I think he had a journalist, but it was a small group. There were about 3 or 4 people eating and hundreds watching. Yeah. So, and that is the problem now is it is technologically feasible. And indeed, there are a couple of U.S. companies today that are also working on this thing too. But it's pretty costly.
Yeah, it was an expensive burger, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was well over $100,000.
I'm sure you'd want to share it. I guess you'd want to keep it mostly yourself.
Of course, as any good entrepreneur does, though, he's optimistic. He thinks he can get the price down to about $30 per pound of burger.
It's still a bit expensive.
It is.
They're going to have to do better than that. Someone wiser and more innovative and even more optimistic is going to have to get involved to make that a viable activity. Let's talk about a downside of or a not so attractive side of this, which is the pink slime controversy. What happened there?
Yeah, well, you sort of stole my thunder because at least in the book, the way I tell the story is I don't tell the stories about pink slime until we get to the end. But so readers, be warned. You've already
spoiler alert. It's too late.
But yeah. So at least the way I tell the story is through the eyes of an entrepreneur. So there's a guy named Eldon Roth. He grew up very poor in South Dakota. He had a variety of odd jobs in the food industry, and one of those jobs was working in a big food meat processing plant where they would make frozen meat products. So they'd take these animals, freeze them, and then distribute them around the country. And he looked around and noticed this freezing process was really inefficient. They're big warehouses that are, the whole warehouse is having to be kept, below freezing essentially. And he had the idea of taking this meat and running it through 2 metal rollers to bring the temperature down really quickly. And the sort of story I tell is, you've probably all seen the Christmas Story where Ralphie's poor friend gets his tongue stuck on the metal flagpole. And that sort of tells you, when something is metal, that could be a lot colder. It can freeze something a lot colder, a lot more quickly. So the same thing works with meat. If he would take these steaks or other cuts and run them through these rollers and bring them down to temperature really quick, which is useful because lowers the chance of spoilage, but also sort of eliminated some of this waste of just cooling down a bunch of air, if you will. So he had invented this technology and went off and created several companies to use this technology and was just looking for new opportunities. And one of the biggest opportunities out there is ground meat. It's one of the biggest markets that exists. So if you take the average cow that comes through, about half of the meat on that cow is ultimately going to wound up as ground meat or as hamburger. And what he noticed though was a lot of the meat from the animal wasn't being used. And the problem here, the way I frame the problem, is one about food waste. That there are a lot of people concerned that we throw away too much food, and that was something like that was the food wasn't actually being thrown away in this case, but it was being used in less productive ways. And there are lots of cuts from an animal that are really fatty, but they do have pieces of meat in there. It's just not very economical to pay someone to use their knife to cut them out. So he developed this process where he heated up the cuts of meat not to a point that it cooked the meat, but to such a point that it would melt the fat. And he would put that in a centrifuge and pull the fat away from the protein. And then that protein is the same protein that we'd have in any other of our hamburgers. He reintroduced that protein. He then collected all that protein and he could mix it in with ground beef. And so essentially he was cutting down on food waste. And there are several estimates of how much waste it was cutting down, but at least one that he claims, that his company claims, is that this process is equivalent of saving over 5,000 head of cattle every day in the United States.
Might be a slightly higher estimate than the actual one, but it's clearly saved some.
It's more than zero.
Right, definitely.
and so, yeah. And so he had a very successful business. So he was able to pull out these useful parts of protein, and people were mixing them in with ground meat. And so it lowered the price of ground meat. Not only did it lower the price, it also lowered the fat content. So this is, in the 80s and 90s, there was a big low fat push.
People thought fat was bad then. Yeah.
They did, yeah. So this was an inexpensive way to get very lean ground beef. And he had a very successful business going on. All was proceeding smoothly. And then a series of media stories broke that most people are probably aware of. And this product he was producing, the name they were using and the name that's still used in the industry is finely textured beef, lean, finely textured beef. But at some point it got the name pink slime. And from there on, he ran into a lot of trouble.
Yeah, one of those is not like the other.
Right.
One of them sounds kind of interesting. The other sounds awful. What was the nature of the controversy? What were people upset? Why did they call it pink slime? Because it wasn't real meat? What was the issue?
in a lot of ways, this is a really sad story, I think. I've been in his plant. I've seen the process. It's only pink because it's frozen, as is any other meat that you freeze, and it's not slimy at all. In fact, if you Google pink slime, the image that you see is almost certainly not his product. In fact, I've talked to a lot of people in the food industry. Nobody really knows what it is, but it's probably not food. But anyway,
why did he get slimed for that? I understand part of it. Part of this, the impact of the story came from the labeling of it as pink slime and the some of these images that may not be accurate. But what was the issue at all? Why did anybody care?
I think people didn't know about it, and when they learned this process was being used, they probably felt a bit deceived. And there was another aspect to the process that I haven't mentioned, which is that one part of the process, right before they package it, they put a small mist of ammonia on the top.
That was it.
Which lowers the pH, just makes it so that bacteria aren't nearly as likely to live. And it was probably that caused a lot of concern. Oh, you're putting this chemical in our food and we don't know about it, and it's in all of our school lunches, and how dare it sort of fed into a narrative that exists about these evil big food processors that are just trying to make a buck while selling us this inexpensive, unsafe food. But the more you push on that story, the less it holds water. So, for example, in a given hamburger, there's more ammonia in the bun and the cheese than there is in even the meat where this little mist of ammonia was applied. This ammonia, by the way, it's a ingredient that the FDA recognizes as generally acceptable as safe. In other words, you can use it all you want to. If you want. But
if you drink it, it'll kill you. That's the problem, right? If you drink your cleaning product, you're going to be rushed to the hospital, and it's the same word. So it is. Doesn't sound so good.
Like most chemicals, it's the dose makes the poison.
Yeah, correct.
That's true of even things we routinely eat, whether it's salt or any number of things. And so, I think, the media storm came about because it again fit this narrative of big bad food. Doing, almost like a jungle sort of story that there's these things going on in these meat plants that we don't know anything about. And for me, I think sort of the sad story about it is this, he's a small business owner. I mean, he had 2 or 3 plants, but this is not some big conglomerate. Moreover, I've been in a lot of food plants. His plant was one of the safest plants, cleanest plants, and he had invested millions of his own dollars to make sure his product was safe. I talk about these things in the book, but he washes the air in his plant. He sucks the air out, runs it through a washer before it comes out. His plant is pressurized to keep out bacteria and other problems from the outside. So, for example, when you're coming outside of the plant, you open the door to go to the outside. The air basically pushes you out. I almost fell down when I was there the day. So the story that somehow it was unsafe and this guy was trying to hide things, just really, I don't think fit the facts. Moreover, I think the real challenge is when you contrast it against this other narrative that we have, that we really want people to not waste food. And we want to make use of every morsel. Here was a person doing that, doing the best he could. He saw an opportunity to eliminate food waste. He did it in the best way he could, in the safest way he could, won all these food safety awards. And then we vilify him for doing it.
I think we have a primal dislike. You talked earlier about, I just want to eat God's food or natural food. And inevitably, most of the stuff we eat doesn't fit our romantic associations, whether it's what's really going on in a slaughterhouse or how the hens are treated or how meat's processed. It's going to inevitably jar us when we come face to face with this. And people who are upset about that, I think, are going to use any way they can. This, I think, is a very effective propaganda effect for them. It probably turned a few more people into vegetarians as a result. I want to turn for a minute. I want to leave a little time at the end for policy issues, but that we haven't talked about yet. But I want to say something briefly about Walmart, because Walmart's entry into the grocery business and the food business is such an enormous. It has such an enormous impact, and I just want you to tell the story about 2 things really. One is, I'm thinking of interview we did with Roger Berkowitz and Legal Seafoods, and the care he has to take, purely self-interested or altruistic, doesn't matter, to make sure that the food is relatively safe, because his brand name is very at risk every day. And that's true of Walmart as well. And what they're doing with rotisserie chickens, which we've talked about in passing in a different context recently with, I think with Robert Frank. I think that the Chicken World thing came up. But talk about what they're doing with chickens, rotisserie chickens, to make sure that they're safe.
Yeah, well, first, just on the scale of Walmart, I think their data suggests that 1/3 of all Americans enter a Walmart every week. I mean, that's absolutely crazy.
Mind-boggling.
Something like 1/4 of all the food dollars spent in grocery outlets are spent at a Walmart. And so this is big. Whatever they do is big stuff. And you're right. We think, as you say, we may get a little bit to policy issues, and we want stricter food, standards and what have you. But companies like Walmart, and a good example here recently is Chipotle. The biggest deal for them is their brand name. They've spent millions, probably even billions of dollars in the case of somebody like Walmart, developing a brand name and a brand reputation, and that's what lets them earn a little bit of a premium over the generics, or gets those 1/3 of the Americans going in there every week. It's because they have a little bit of brand equity, and so they want to protect that, and it's worth it to them. And as the VP of Food Safety from Walmart told me, he said, the government regulations, that's like the baseline. We go way above that because they've got something much larger at stake. And so one of the things he talked about was the technologies they're using to make sure the rotisserie chickens are safe. So the old system was that the government would send around inspectors to test the temperatures on their chickens, make sure they were cooking them to a high enough temperature, killed all the bacteria. And at least over one reporting period, they found out that across all their about 4,000 stores in the U.S., they had 10 government inspectors stop by to see if they were doing what they were supposed to do. Walmart, because they're concerned about their reputation, also paid some third-party auditors to go by, and in that same time period, the people they paid to check up on them stopped by about 100 times. They're selling millions of chickens, so there's still a good chance that the chicken you or I might have bought in the checkout line was not somebody wasn't following up to make sure it really was cooked to the temperature it was supposed to. So what they did is they implemented some wireless thermometers. They give their employees, and now every single chicken temperature is checked before it's put out on the line. And moreover, that data is immediately sent to Walmart's offices where they can monitor and record everyone. So they went essentially from testing 10 chickens every month to millions. So as the guy that's head of
10 chickens, but the amount that 10 people could check, whatever that is.
Exactly. Yeah. 10 people.
Hundreds probably. Yeah.
To millions. Exactly. So as the head of food safety for Walmart told me, their sample size is all. So N equals all. They're testing every single one of them now.
I believe. It's amazing.
And, so they can check on certain stores. Do they have a manager at a store who's not being as careful as he should be? Are there maybe certain times of years, or even certain suppliers maybe who, I guess the suppliers wouldn't have anything to do with the temperature, but it's certainly in terms of testing for bacteria. That's the other thing Walmart did. One thing about their size that's interesting is when they make a change, it has a big impact not just on the people shopping at Walmart, but across the whole industry. So a few years ago, they implemented new standards for testing for E. coli and Salmonella, and there's some good evidence to suggest that when Walmart enforced these higher standards, it improved the safety of all the meat throughout the whole supply chain.
Because
Walmart is such a big buyer. That a lot of these food processing plants, say a beef processing plant, they're not just selling to Walmart; they're selling to everybody else too. So if they're gonna adopt new safety standards to meet Walmart, as long as they've got those standards in place, it's still going to impact the meat they're selling elsewhere.
So I, like you, tend to be pretty happy with the state of food. I'm 61 years old. I remember something of what a grocery store was like in, say, 1965 or 1970. And for all the complaints that you hear, the variety of cooked and unprocessed food that's available in a grocery store today, it's an extraordinary achievement. It's just an amazing effect of technology and innovation and research. Some of that is, of course, coming from the government or government subsidies to schools like Oklahoma State. And you talk about that a little in the book. I'm a little more skeptical, but a lot of people would say that's been a great thing. But certainly a lot of it has been just the entrepreneurial innovators in the purely private sector, whether it's in the retailing aspect of it or the processing. It's an incredibly innovative area. And the result is lots of different kinds of food, low prices, which raises the standard of living of people over time. And it's a glorious thing. So that's my perspective. The other perspective on the other side is, people you call the food movement. They see this as an industrial, corporate, profit-driven activity where a lot of the negative downside effects are hidden or borne by others. And then at a different piece of this, you have people like Nassim Taleb on the program here who said that we're playing with fire, that the risks of the innovations that have driven some of these productivity changes through genetic modification are really, we don't know enough about them. So what do you think we ought to do about that disagreement? The fact that there are people like you who think the science is on your side, things are safe, these things are not to be worried about. If you want to use organic food, you want to eat organic food, help yourself. But the rest of us would like to eat our steaks and eat them in a certain way, and thank you very much. And the other side saying, no, you're really having the threat of an impact much beyond your own stomach and your own table. What do you feel about that fight, that tension, and what government should do, if anything, to adjudicate that dispute?
So I think one useful thing is to, at least I try to do in this book, is accept the premise that a lot of people in the food movement have, that we have some problems. It's not a perfect system. There's some people that go hungry. We do have some bad environmental consequences of some of our practices. So those problems are real, and I agree they're real. So I think the bigger challenge is to say, what are we going to do about them? And are the actions, are the policy prescriptions they're proposing going to meaningfully have an impact on human health or the environment? Before this, I wrote another book called The Food Police. It's a little more argumentative and polemical, but in that book, I sort of try to evaluate a lot of the policy prescriptions and proposals that people have. And I think just the unfortunate, reality is a lot of the things people propose, whether it's GMO labeling or fat taxes, or taxes on meat, for example. I mean, they'll have some effect, but they're not going to meaningfully, I don't think, have impacts on human health and the environment that we really want. At least the only way for those kind of taxes to have the kinds of impacts they want is to be so burdensome that we're really restricting people's freedom and coercing people in a way I think they wouldn't like. And I suppose that's one of the reasons I'm optimistic about technology use, is that when I look back at, the increase in variety that you see there, it's also just an incredible increase in efficiency. If we can get more meat from each animal, if we can get more eggs from each chicken, if we can get more corn from each unit of land and each pound of fertilizer, that's leaving more for future generations. That's lowering food prices for people that have a hard time affording enough food to eat. And so, really, I think one of the things I'm sort of asking for here is, at least among some people in the food movement, is, let technology be at least one piece of the solution. It doesn't have to be the only part, but it hopefully should play a role in dealing with some of these food problems. And I think for whatever negative things I might have to say about some of the things advocated by the food movement, they've done a lot of positive things too, and they have increased choice and variety. You can go to farmers markets now. You can buy local foods. You can buy organic foods. Now, I think some of the arguments made for buying those are kind of silly, but the fact that those choices exist is wonderful. And the fact that people can choose to pay a little more to get those things is great. It's a great part of our market economy. And the government has facilitated that to some extent, helping standardize labels or helping make sure that there are market institutions for these I think are positive. I think a lot of the big worry about food technology is not, nobody really, not many people come out and say, well, I'm against the use of science in food. Nobody says I'm anti-science. I think the concern probably, if I had to be tried to be fair about it, is that there's a view that the benefits of these technologies are mainly accruing to these large corporations, and those benefits aren't being distributed equally to farmers and to consumers, and they're causing all these externalities. That's not a view I happen to agree with, but I can understand where it's coming from. And I suppose in terms of the sort of policy question, I think the way I would look at that is, the answer is, if you don't like Walmart or Monsanto or Kellogg food, Kraft Foods, or what have you, in my mind, the answer isn't to get rid of those companies, to ban them or to restrict them. The question is to make sure that the barriers to entry are low enough that anybody can compete with them. And, one of the problems I think sometimes these big companies try to do is erect all sorts of barriers to entry. And ironically, one of the barriers to entry they do is to say, well, we need really stringent safety tests. We want to do a lot of super duper tests and have a lot of regulations before you can introduce this new biotech food. That helps preserve the status quo and the incumbent firms, and keeps out all the small startups who don't have the teams of lawyers to make it through this regulatory process. So, I think, unfortunately, and somewhat ironically, these calls for increased regulations and increased standards actually serve to benefit these larger companies that people are saying they don't like. And so what I'd like to see, though, is to have make it easier for there to be more competition from entrepreneurs and innovators.
My guest today has been Jayson Lusk. His book is Unnaturally Delicious. Jayson, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thanks for having me on.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.